I often wonder if madness is inside the collective humanity, inside the minds of our brains. A sort of frequency of derision, the chaos of a multiplicity of thought. And that this madness, at least to my imagination, manifests in a subspace sound, a vibration, a deep baritone buzzing sound radiating out. But enough of my melancholy. This morning I tried to focus my random thoughts. At length I could focus on the Lord of Truth, a moment of clarity and sound mind. As I stood so in front of the light, in my meditative pose, I started to perceive something. It was as if my stature, the length of my being, as it were, could reach into the heavens with my mind. This made me think of the Hebrew letter, Lamed, which has in its shape a little tower in the air, as it is called, reaching into heaven, above the line relative to the other letters. Now this Lamed is a letter and agency, and in some way represents the human being itself. It is the grown man or grown woman standing. The Apostle Paul says that there are two kinds of food, or really revelation from heaven. There is the milk for the babies, and the meat for the adults. They receive different things. He also says, I knew a man who was caught up to heaven. Is this word, man, meaningful as far as the vertical standing of the Lamed? I am not sure, and I may be imposing too liberally here. At any event, I got a clue as I stood so, in standing, in front of the light, with a stable mind. I got the clue of the standing man or standing woman. The clue of the Lamed, from our angle, is one. And by one, I mean singularness. Remember, God says of himself, the Lord your God is one. For our purposes here, and our own oneness, it may be helpful to understand our oneness by attaching it to the notion of aloneness. So alone that we are one. Or so one of self that one is alone. I am not talking about fellowship with humans and family, nor our union with God, He in us and we in Him, a verse in the Bible which I read almost every single day for the last year. I am talking about the feeling of self in the chaotic mind of the brain. Stand before God, by faith, by imagination, by feeling, and focus on stillness of thought, feel the fullness of self, in the house of masculinity if male, or the house of femininity if female, feel oneness of self, with awareness. This is the standing of the Lamed. On a nearby note, it is interesting that the Hebrew word for mind, in our context, is spelled Lamed, Beth. There are two bets, and bets are a housing agency, a thing that contains and produces. The mind has two bets, two houses. I suppose one can go in many directions here with the interpretation of the two houses of the mind. But, for the sake of our point, correctly or not, we can say let the first house should not be a producer and keeper of every memory and every thought, and instead make it a house that stores one thing, store the feeling of oneness, the lonely man on the mountain, entirely alone. It is an interface. And the second house, for our purposes, the house of masculinity or femininity, and the feeling thereof, so that we are not dislocated beings, without a house, flying about naked. Let us help our minds to help us. Let us not be a conglomerate being.